government watchdog just put $15 billion of your tax money in writing and said it went straight into the hands of organized crime. Then someone redacted it. Then the person who redacted it became premier. And now the guy who replaced her is standing at a podium promising a royal commission like it's supposed to fix everything. Hey guys, Daniel here, Daniel Reports. If you're new, this is the channel where I break down what's actually happening with your money, property, the economy, government spending, without the spin. And I need you to sit with this one for a second, because this isn't a normal political story. This is a state government that got caught on paper, having been warned about criminals sitting inside its biggest construction sites, and instead of acting on it, buried it. So let's start with the sentence that should be the headline everywhere, and somehow isn't. Barrister Jeffrey Watson, the guy brought in to investigate corruption inside the CFMEU, wrote a report. Part of it got redacted before it reached the public. And the section that got blacked out alleged that $15 billion of government money had been poured directly into the hands of criminals and organized crime gangs. Not misspent, not wasted. Poured into the hands of criminals. That's the actual language. And it was hidden from you, the taxpayer who funded it. If that number is even close to right, that's not a scandal. That's one of the largest transfers of public money to organized crime in this country's history. And I want to be upfront with you before we go further. Watson's allegation hasn't been tested in court. Nobody's been convicted off the back of that figure. But the fact that it was written down by the state's own appointed investigator and then redacted tells you everything about how this was being managed before it became your problem too. Now stick with me, because this is bigger than one union and one report. This is about a state carrying close to $200 billion in debt by the end of the decade, interest bills heading toward $32 million a day, and a construction program that was supposed to build the state's future and instead became, according to the government's own investigator, a pipeline for organized crime. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why the premier, who presided over most of it, just resigned. Why her replacement lasted about 24 hours before he had to call a royal commission, and why I don't think a royal commission alone is going to fix what's actually broken here. Before I keep going, if you're finding this useful, do me a favor and hit subscribe now, because we're only about a minute in, and there's a lot more here that genuinely surprised me doing the research. Let's get into it. Back in 2015, the Victorian government launched what it called the Big Build. $100 billion, give or take, poured into road and rail, the Metro Tunnel, the Northeast Link, the Suburban Rail Loop, dozens of projects stacked on top of each other across a single decade. On paper, this is generational infrastructure. In practice, it required an enormous, sustained army of tradies, which meant one union ended up with more leverage over a single government spending than almost any union in the country's history. The CFMEU. Here's the part that matters. The Victorian branch of the CFMEU wasn't just a union working these sites, it was a registered affiliate of the State Labor Party. It donated more than $3 million to that same party during the 2022 election. So you've got the party in government, the union running the sites, and the union funding the party's campaigns, all sitting on top of a $100 billion spending pipeline. If you were designing a system where oversight quietly disappears, this is roughly what it would look like. For a long time, that was just an uncomfortable arrangement nobody wanted to talk about too loudly. Then in 2024, a joint investigation between major outlets and a national broadcaster blew it open. What came out was genuinely hard to believe. Allegations that outlaw motorcycle gang members had been placed on building sites, that workers were told to hand over cash just to get onto lucrative shifts, and, this is the detail that stuck with me, claims that some sites were being used as drug distribution points. Within weeks, the union's construction division in Victoria was put into administration. That's when Watson, the barrister I mentioned earlier, was brought in to actually investigate. He gave evidence to a state inquiry describing what happened in blunt terms. The flood of government money, in his words, made the Big Build ripe for corruption. He alleged the conditions on these sites allowed the union to collaborate with outlaw motorcycle gangs, and that potential workers effectively had to pay cash bribes just to get put on shifts. And then came the $15 billion line. Watson's report on the Victorian branch went to the union's administrator, and 9 newspapers later reported that the administrator had redacted parts of it before release. The section that got cut was the one alleging $15 billion in government money had gone to criminals and organized crime gangs. Now here's where it gets political, not just criminal. When this was put to then Premier Jacinta Allen, her government didn't call for a royal commission. It pushed back. A Labor MP publicly called the $15 billion figure unfounded and untested. Allen herself argued that previous royal commissions on other topics hadn't fixed the underlying issues, so what was the point of another one? Whether or not you agree with that logic, notice what it does in practice. It keeps the most powerful investigative tool this country has, one with subpoena powers and the ability to compel testimony under oath, off the table. Convenient if you're the government whose watch this happened on. Quick pause here. If this is the kind of story you want more of, that's literally what this channel is for, breaking down where public money actually goes. Subscribe if you haven't. It genuinely helps this channel keep doing this kind of digging. So was Allen just unaware this was happening? That's the question everyone kept asking, and the answer that's emerged is uncomfortable. Leaked documents show that while Allen was Minister for Transport Infrastructure, the portfolio that ran the big build for close to a decade before she became Premier, 4 of the most senior advisors around her put a written warning in front of her office. It described systemic misconduct tied to the union on major state project sites, drafted somewhere between 2022 and 2024, well before any of this became public. That's not a case of a Premier blindsided by a scandal that happened on someone else's watch. That's a minister who ran the portfolio for 9 years, was warned in writing about criminal infiltration on her own sites, and for months afterward kept telling the public that budget blowouts on the big build were simply inflationary pressures. 2 very different explanations for the same set of numbers. One says the market did this to her, the other says it was happening on the inside the whole time. You can decide which one survives contact with a written warning sitting in a drawer. Let's talk about what this costs you if you live there, because the corruption story and the debt story are the same story, they're just told separately. Victoria's net debt is on track to hit close to $200 billion by 2030. According to this year's state budget papers, annual interest repayments alone are forecast to climb to $11.8 billion a year by then. That works out to more than $32 million every single day, just in interest, before a single new hospital bed or train carriage gets funded. Victoria is now forecast to run more than $30 billion in cumulative cash deficits over the next 4 years, and one independent economist put it about as plainly as you can. Until a government is running actual cash surpluses, it isn't paying down debt, it's still adding to it. Every year that passes with sites potentially inflated by the kind of misconduct Watson described is a year that debt pile gets harder to justify. And Victoria isn't just Australia's most indebted state in dollar terms. It also carries the country's lowest state credit rating, which makes every dollar it borrows from here more expensive than the exact same dollar borrowed by New South Wales or Queensland. That's not an abstract detail. That's a direct compounding cost that gets passed down to whoever's paying Victorian taxes for the next decade. If you want to know where a chunk of that gap came from, go back to the Commonwealth Games. Victoria signed up to host the 2026 Games in regional cities. The projected cost blew out from around $2.6 billion to more than $6 billion, and the government cancelled the entire event in 2023. The state ended up paying several $100 million just to settle with the Commonwealth Games Federation for walking away, money spent for 0 games, 0 legacy infrastructure, nothing. Just an exit fee. Here's a detail I think gets buried under all the corruption headlines, and it shouldn't. Jacinta Allen didn't win an election to become Premier. She was installed by her own party room in 2023 after Daniel Andrews resigned midterm. And when Allen resigned this year under the weight of this scandal, her deputy, Ben Carroll, was installed the same way by the party room with no Victorian getting a vote. And the next election still months away in November. Twice in one term, the person running the state with a $200 billion debt pile and an active corruption crisis got there without a single Victorian voter having a say. I'm not saying that's illegal, it isn't, it's how the system works, but it's worth sitting with because it means the accountability moment everyone's been waiting for keeps getting delayed until the actual election. To his credit, Carroll's very first act as Premier was calling the Royal Commission Allen had refused for months. He also announced a special prosecutor to work alongside it and said at his first press conference and he wants no stone unturned, whether it is top-tier contractors, subcontractors, labour hire, government unions. He explicitly tried to draw a line under the past, telling Victorians, I'm not Daniel Andrews, I'm not Jacinta Allen. That's a strong opening line. But before you take it at face value, remember who Ben Carroll actually is. He wasn't a backbencher watching this unfold from a distance. He was Deputy Premier the entire time it played out, and he publicly defended Allen through most of the worst of it. He also held education during a period of record teacher strikes and exam administration failures, and he was in cabinet while the Metro Tunnel itself, one of the flagship big build projects, blew out from roughly $9 billion to $15 billion. So the man now promising a clean investigation was, by his own government's numbers, standing right next to most of the spending that investigation is going to examine. There's also a structural problem worth flagging, honestly. Victoria's own Premier said last week that previous royal commissions didn't deal with the issues and the problems remained after they concluded. That's not me being cynical. That's the outgoing government's own assessment of how much these inquiries actually change. And realistically, past Victorian Royal Commissions have taken well over a year to report, meaning this one will still be in its early stages when Victorians finally get to vote in November. The investigation everyone demanded is starting, but the accountability moment is still going to arrive after the ballot, not before it. Quick reminder, if you're finding this valuable, like the video, and if you know someone who lives in Victoria or just cares about where their tax dollars actually go, send this to them. That's genuinely how a channel like this grows, one share at a time, and I read every comment, so tell me what you think down there too. Here's something I think gets lost in all the biggest scandal in the state's history framing. Australia has actually done a full royal commission into union corruption before, and it's centred on the exact same organisation. Back in 2014, following earlier reporting on corrupt conduct inside the CFMEU and other unions, the federal government stood up the Royal Commission into Trade Union Governance and Corruption, headed by a former High Court judge. More than half of that commission's hearings ended up focused on the CFMEU specifically, evidence of intimidation, standover tactics, the use of motorcycle gangs as hired muscle, and illegal deals struck with employers across 3 states. Before that, in 1986, Victoria lived through this exact pattern with a different union entirely. The old Builders Labourers Federation was deregistered after its secretary was convicted of taking secret payments and building materials from contractors. Several of the officials caught up in that scandal went on to join the union that eventually became the modern CFMEU, so this isn't a one-off failure. It's the 3rd time in roughly 40 years that a construction union with this much control over Victorian building sites has ended up at the centre of a major corruption inquiry. If a Royal Commission alone actually solved this problem, we wouldn't need a 3rd one. That's not a reason to skip the inquiry, it's a reason to be honest that the inquiry is the start of accountability, not the end of it. There's one more thread worth pulling, because it goes beyond Victoria's own budget. A chunk of big build funding, including money that flowed into hospital construction, came from the Commonwealth, meaning it passed through the federal government before it ever reached a Victorian building site. The federal opposition has now publicly pushed the Prime Minister to explain what assurances his government received from Victoria that Commonwealth taxpayer money on these projects was actually protected, particularly after further allegations emerged involving intervention on a Commonwealth-funded hospital redevelopment. There's also a petition sitting with tens of thousands of signatures calling for a separate Senate inquiry into all of this at the federal level. So depending on how this plays out, this stops being a Victorian state story and turns into a question about federal oversight of every dollar Canberra hands down to the states for major projects. That's a much bigger story than one premier resigning, and it's one I'll be tracking closely on this channel. Step back from the individual names for a second, because the mechanism here is the part that should worry you regardless of which state you live in. You had one union with outsized control over who gets hired on a $100 billion spending program, funding the political party that oversees that same program, on top of alleged links to organised crime. And the state's own investigator says $15 billion of your money may have moved through that pipeline into criminal hands. Whether the final number ends up higher, lower, or contested entirely once the Royal Commission actually does its job, the structure that allowed it to even be plausible isn't unique to Victoria. Any state running enormous infrastructure programs with heavy union involvement and weak transparency has some version of the same exposure. That's the actual lesson here, not just one premier resigned. And this is exactly why every dollar of debt Victoria is now carrying deserves more scrutiny, not less, because a real chunk of it, according to the government's own appointed investigator, may not have gone to infrastructure at all. So here's my honest take, and I genuinely like to hear if you disagree. I don't think Ben Carroll calling a Royal Commission on day one is nothing. It's a real change from months of we don't support the calls. But I also don't think a man who spent the last 2 years defending the outgoing premier is the person to convince me this is a genuine reset rather than the most convenient possible moment to look tough, right before an election where his party desperately needs to look like it's cleaned house. Time, and honestly the special prosecutor's findings, will tell us which one it actually was. Let me know in the comments, do you think this Royal Commission actually gets to the truth? Or is Victoria just getting a new face on the same arrangement? I read every single comment, so tell me what you think. If you got this far, you clearly care about where public money actually ends up. That's exactly what Daniel Reports covers, so just make sure you're subscribed, drop a like if this was useful, and share it with someone who needs to see where their tax dollars are going. I'll see you in the next one.